This is Echo 3, and let's continue our modded career mode discussion. We have a couple contracts for Gilly, one to land on Gilly, and another for planting a flag on Gilly. These will pair very well together, so I might as well double up my contracts that way. I would like to unlock more missions with the Kerbin Side Remastered, giving aircraft a purpose. So I need to start landing at as many different airfields as possible. So we're going to go ahead and pick up the land at the desert airfield. I'm going to go ahead and just use a craft that I've already made. Here is an airplane that can hold all the passengers I need and a pilot. We'll go ahead, take off, and head our way towards the desert airfield. I've flown back and forth between the two quite a bit, so I already know exactly which way to start heading. I'm going to use the AtmosphereAutopilot mod, and that's going to save me a lot of time, and then I'll just, for you, save a lot of time by cutting out the transit time. What I am using as well is the mod BetterTimeWarp, and I have changed my physical time warp. The fastest rate I'll go is 6 now instead of 4, and that seems to work pretty well for these missions. So that also helps cut down on all the time spent as far as traveling back and forth. So I like the way that pairs pretty well for my mod list. Cut it out again. We're just going to go ahead and fly back here to the Kerbal Space Center. When we land and recover the craft, then we'll be able to start thinking about our next mission. So I can fly with time warp on ×2 speed on the approach until I get really close to landing, then I'll cut off the time warp. That's what I've done. I'm watching my contract parameters there. Once that's all set up as far as the weight, we can recover the craft, recover our Kerbals. Let's go ahead and build our craft for going to Gilly. Now I'd like to send at least 2 Kerbals there. It's nice when you can have a scientist with you, because then you can reset science experiments and get a lot more out of them. So I'm going to send this Gemini-style capsule there, and we do not really need a lot of Delta V. This is going to be the section of the craft that descends to Gilly, and we're going to gather a lot of science with it, and this will be our return section as well. I am using some engines from the Near Future mod. I like a lot of those. I find them just probably a little better efficiency, better weight. So in most circumstances, one of those engines probably works out better for me. I have some of these liquid hydrogen engines, and I have another mod on top of that that does away with the need for liquid hydrogen, so I will just use the stock liquid fuel in the game and still be able to use these engines. So I've liked the way that mod section pairs for me. After we build our main section, our return section of the craft anyway, I would like to send a probe that will remain in orbit around Gilly, so I can then use some of these ScanSat mod parts, which will eventually be able to get ScanSat contracts for Gilly. Right now I can't get any contracts for that until we have orbited Gilly, so I will leave this orbiter around Gilly, and we'll be able to get some more use out of it in the future. I might as well leave some relay dishes on there. Perhaps in the future, if I want to do more in the Eve system, having a relay satellite there will be handy. This is another one of the Near Future engines that I believe is one of the hydrogen engines as well, that will just use liquid fuel with the way I have my game set up. Make sure that these parts stay in the cargo bay, that way they won't get damaged on ascent. Make sure I got the right Kerbals in there. I do want a scientist and a pilot. We'll be sending Jeb. And with this all done, we just need to really design our ascent stage, which Gilly really is one of the easier places to get to in terms of Delta V. Getting to Eve really doesn't cost that much, usually around 1,100 meters per second of Delta V. You can get to Eve pretty reasonably. So getting to Gilly then, need to count on maybe changing inclination there in the Eve system. It can be done fairly cheaply, and so going to Duna and landing on Ike can be one of your first missions and work out well, or Gilly as another great destination for your first landing outside of the Kerbin system. My first was Ike, and it was such an exciting mission. Shortly after that probably was Gilly. I don't remember the next place I went. although Gilly can be a bit of a challenge, and we will see how that ends up working out for me as well. Because Gilly has so low gravity, things just operate a little bit differently there. Once we get into orbit, I'm going to go ahead and set up my maneuver out to Eve using the new in-game tool. And as long as you are in a fairly equatorial and mostly circular orbit, the tool works pretty well. If your orbit is elliptical or if it is inclined too much, the calculator doesn't seem to do a very good job. And so this is the encounter it set up for me around Eve, and then I will try and burn retrograde here. Now what I'm trying to do specifically is get my apoapsis to line up with my ascending descending nodes with Gilly. That way I can change my inclination pretty far out around Eve, and that will be a much cheaper inclination change burn. So that's the way I'm planning on doing this. And we'll get as much science in the Eve system as we can. Although we've been to Eve before in this game, so there really isn't too much more science for me to be had just around Eve. And I believe we've even visited Gilly before. But in this case, I'm going to land and try and get as much, well, at least a reasonable amount of science. Because Gilly has such low gravity, we'll be able to biome hop very cheaply, which means we'll just burn our engines a little bit until we get over a new biome and land there. That's a great way to get a lot of science in your games, is to biome hop. Rovers, in my opinion, just tend to be more of a pain, and I'd rather not spend all that time, although I do have the mod BonVoyage, and that does make traveling around with a rover easier because you can then set it and forget it and come back to it when it's at its destination. Be very careful when you're trying to get into orbit around Gilly because your velocities are so low, it's really easy to, if you're pulling too hard on your maneuver node maker, to overdo it. So once here at Gilly, we will go ahead and just start gathering as much science as we can. I'm going to try and get into a polar orbit, specifically for our science equipment on the probe section that we're going to leave in orbit. So we'll just try to get in a reasonably circular orbit. I have pulled up KerbNet as well, which we can use to scan the surface of the planet, and you can find different biomes. You can find anomalies with this. I have done a tutorial on how to use KerbNet. It's a really interesting tool. The ScanSat mod as well offers some of the same functionality as KerbNet, but KerbNet is part of the stock game, so if you don't have access to mods or choose not to use them, try out KerbNet. It is a really unique feature in the game, quite handy. The ScanSat mod takes a lot of that information and then lets me get contracts to land at those interesting locations, which I have already done in this series at Duna. Perhaps we will try finding some other interesting landing locations around the Kerbin system as well. Alright, we try to land this thing, and landing on Gilly is quite a pain. It's really easy to bounce up and almost get back into orbit. Patience can really wear thin when your craft is just not falling very quickly. I have to be very careful with my Kerbal as well. I don't generally want to jump or even walk too much on the surface. I'll just use my EVA pack and be almost more like an orbital EVA because the gravity is just so low. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump over to another biome. I'm using Kerbal Engineer to let me know what biome I'm predicted to land in. That's a very useful feature that I like to use. Now I can get something similar with KerbNet and plot a landing location with it, which I could have done, gone to my probe core, found a different biome, set a location there to land. That would work for me. I just find this a little easier. Now this is where the low gravity on Gilly is causing me a lot of issues. I need to find somewhere flat enough to really just park this craft. And I'm using Kerbal Engineer's landing guidance. That's that predictor, that circle you see, just to tell me where I am expected to land. Another useful feature that you can use from Kerbal Engineer. I find it difficult to play almost without Kerbal Engineer, just because of all the information it is able to give me, and very easily. That's the stock display. That's the display you see up there beside the stock user interface. So all those numbers up there at the top of the screen, I really like that. I don't know what you like to use, but I really find Kerbal Engineer very useful. Some people like to use the displays from MechJeb. I find MechJeb, I guess, too overpowered for my general style of play, and I haven't used it in quite a few years. But other people do like to use MechJeb. I do like that the maneuver tool has been added into the game. That is something MechJeb did very well with planning maneuvers for you and helping you get where you needed to go. With the maneuver tool in the game, though, I do need to get into a fairly circular orbit, and that's what I have done here, and now it can calculate my maneuver back to Kerbin. So once that's done, we'll just have to wait for a transfer window. So I'm getting into a basically equatorial circular orbit around Eve. Now that I have done that, it can plot my orbit back to Kerbin, and it's done that. We just wait for our transfer window, which is quite a ways away, just with the way things have lined up here, but using Time Warp. And I am using Better Time Warp. It does let me go even faster on the regular Time Warp there. I think about 10 times faster is the way it's set up right now. So it does make those waits between transfer windows just not take nearly as long. Well, so we'll set up our encounter here with Kerbin, and ultimately we need to air brake and land. We don't need to get into orbit around Kerbin. When we are coming back to Kerbin, I do like to try and land as close as I can to the Kerbal Space Center, which is what I'm going to try to do as we come in with our maneuvers. It's not really that important, but when you're playing in a career mode game, the amount of funds you get back from your craft will depend on how far away you land from the Kerbal Space Center. With the further away you are, the less funds you get. If you're playing with the Making History DLC, you do get access to some other launch sites. So if you land exactly at those other launch sites, you can get 100% recovery there. But if you don't land exactly at the other launch site, it will then factor your recovery amount from how far you away from the main Kerbal Space Center. So generally I try to land fairly close to the main Kerbal Space Center. In this case, we're going to land in the ocean just west of the center, which to me is a pretty good landing. Now that we've recovered that and got lots of science from that mission, we'll be able to unlock a lot more cool things with our community tech tree. There's a lot of science points there. What I'd like to do at this point, though, is I want to unlock more with our flight progress level. There's some really cool missions here that I'd like to have access to, but in order to get a higher flight progress level with the Kerbin Side Remastered Giving Aircraft a Purpose mod, I have to land at all of these different launch sites. So we need to go ahead and just unlock them as it's kind of designed here. This next launch site is way up close to the North Pole, so I thought I would design a plane that can just go really, really far. In this case, it's going to be an electric airplane that is roughly inspired by a P-51 Mustang, which is kind of what I've got going on here. And in order to make it an electric plane, we'll go ahead and throw on a bunch of solar panels as well. The nice thing with electric planes is that they can have basically an infinite range in sunlight. The downside with electric planes is that you cannot use physics warp, the physics time warp, when you fly. You can try, it's just that any time gained or whatever from using the physics warp, the craft seems to physically slow down. So it doesn't really work out at all. The propellers just do not handle physics time warp very well. So I should have thought through this a little better and not made a propeller-driven aircraft. Because while this craft can go all the way up to the destination without issues, I can't use the physics warp, and it's going to take hours to get there. I don't know, over 3 hours. Which, with the Atmospheric Autopilot mod, it can be done. It's just I will have to just let the plane fly for hours while I go do other things. So if you've seen any of my other tutorials as far as making propeller-driven aircraft, this is the same idea. It's going to be a constant speed, variable pitch propeller. So I will set up the Cal 1000 on this aircraft and bind the blade deployment angle to the Cal 1000, and the Cal 1000 itself will be bound to the main throttle. So by increasing the throttle, I will increase the pitch that the propellers are deployed at. So this is what I'm doing. I'm just going ahead and setting that up right now. I'm going with angles between 0 and 40 degrees. So my full throttle really is just setting the blades at 40 degrees, which should be about as fast as this plane can go. This plane has handled really well. I did like that. It's just the downside is it's going to take a really, really long time to fly to my destination. I will go ahead, use the Atmospheric Autopilot mod, kind of set in a few parameters, and I will go off and do other things. Go ahead, I cut all that out. We land, we come back. I decided not to deal with that. Just cut that out because it took a really long time to do. Now I'd like to unlock more of these missions, so I'm going to go ahead and just do more of these missions that will unlock my flight progress level. So we're going to go ahead and go to another airfield. Here's another aircraft I quickly threw together. This one has a jet engine, so I can use the physics warp. And with my 6 times physics warp, it does make flying to some of these other locations really interesting. I didn't highlight this when I selected the contracts, but there is actually a second contract to complete at this airport. So when we land, we will get to investigate an anomaly, which in this case, we're actually landing at the original Kerbal Space Center. So you can see some of these other buildings. This is kind of an Easter egg that you can find, spoiler alert I guess, that you can go ahead and fly this. It's really just north of the desert launch site, so if you have the Making History DLC, you can pretty much just fly north from there and find this place. Kind of fun. You can use KerbNet also to find it. You can find anomalies that way. In the case with my game, using the Kerbin Side Remastered, this is an airport that I have access to. But so here's part of this anomaly, and I'll have my scientists go ahead, get out, and we'll get some funds and reputation points for that. Not really a big deal. Jump back in, and we will fly back to the Space Center. Go ahead, take off here. This is kind of an interesting plane that I created with a single engine there on the back, angled to basically go through my center of mass. It ended up working all right. I had to adjust some of the aerodynamics as far as the exact angle that my wings, especially the back wing, to make it fly better. It ended up working out pretty well for me. I like the aircraft. Was using my joystick to fly some as well. With that done, I'd like to unlock some more of these contracts. Maybe that'll be for next time. So hopefully we'll be able to get into that. I am Echo3. Thanks for joining me on this modded career mode discussion. I will see you next time.